Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you. We have had some technical issues, so I'm going to start talking before you can possibly see something. I can't see anything on my screen at the moment. I know we had uploaded my presentation as a PDF, but I can talk without slides if necessary. It just means you're going to have to focus on me at the top, and I'll try and be as animated as possible while we see if the presentation can catch up. Thank you very much. It's really interesting actually to hear colleagues, particularly from different European perspectives, and certainly some of the work that's happening between countries, between languages. And the danger of coming third in such a setting is that things that have already been said kind of slightly undermine some of the things I'm advocating, or possibly I'm going to see if I can strengthen the things that have been said already. So I'm going to try and turn it around. Particularly, I want to pick up on two issues which I'm going to follow on through when I think about innovation in terms of designing pathways. One is the social context, which Jean-Claude talked about, the blending of leisure and work. I think social context is very important in everything that we design for distance learning, not least because the learners are generally not in front of us and they are in their social context when they study. And also I want to pick up on some of Fabio's comments about the very interesting modeling that goes on in the Edu hackathons. We've had a private side conversation about some of the value in video recording some of those group interactions for future research. But I just wanted I want to really tackle the issue as to whether or not, at a kind of philosophical level, if you like, we are in danger sometimes of looking for technical solutions rather than trying to put the learning design focus very much on the learner. So again, my question to Jean-Claude then at the end, which was, do you find it overly restrictive in terms of models of examinations that are possible, given that you then have a technological constraint? So those are the kinds of issues that I just want to talk about. And I'm going to start by, I want to start by thinking about this in terms of an analogy, which is basically that what we do effectively is kind of drawing maps for our learners. It's a little bit like navigating a map. We produce content, we map, we produce roadmaps effectively through our content, and we then produce assessment as stops along the way, if you like. And I think that's quite a useful analogy. The travel analogy is quite common in education, but I think when we think about who we are designing learning for, controls the journey, analogy in mind. Some of the things that we've talked about already today are the differences between whether or not students are studying as part of cohorts or whether they are studying as individuals. To extend the analogy, and I'm going to flog this analogy to death, by the way, is that you can think about cohorts as taking a bus on a particular journey, stop a solo journey and stopping whenever you like. And clearly both of those present very different technological challenges, but more importantly, very different design challenges as well. I think sometimes we over-expect our technology innovation. We anticipate that we are making much more progress simply because the screens look different. What our students see every day looks a little bit different, and that's in and of itself. We go from this VLE to this open source application, and we can get a bit carried away sometimes in thinking that in and of itself is an innovation. I think arguably there hasn't been a great deal of innovation in terms of truly learning modes, really, other than the interruption of technology. So we've gone from classrooms to remote access, printed materials to digital materials, physical media to the virtual experience, but we haven't really changed as much as perhaps we sometimes think we have. And I would question whether or not a lot of the forms of learning are really new forms. There's been a very interesting discussion online in the UK recently about people asking for alternative pedagogies. And my interaction was simply to say, what alternative for who? You might change platforms. That's an alternative methodology for delivery. it doesn't necessarily change any of the underlying pedagogy itself. We can argue at a different point about the distinction between pedagogy and andragogy and hortagogy and other things, but in terms of the learning delivery, that technology is not always particularly refreshing any of those other underlying messages. So we've seen in the last 20 years, 25 years, that we've got new lexicon, we've got new that we use when we talk about learning. We talk about synchronous and asynchronous learning. We talk about blended, flexible, distance, open, online. But arguably, I would argue what we're really doing is very often is we are simply taking existing, we are effectively transmitting it into our own environments. And I'm as guilty as anybody of doing that. I went back in 2001 when I worked at the Open University. I did what I thought was very innovative work in providing a visual metaphor, visual interface for an online discussion forum where people could drop their comment within a particular visual graphical interface rather than in a list. I was positing that you might want to have a discussion forum alongside a document just by using iframes. So when you change pages, you'd get a new discussion forum against each bit of text. Now, the technology has moved on significantly since then, but the underlying message hasn't really changed particularly in the last 20 years. We're still doing the same thing, we're just doing it in a slightly different way. I think a lot of us were very enthusiastic when Second Life came along because we thought this is a completely new experience for most students. Apart from the connectivity issue, most universities logged on and built entire campuses. I visited any number of theatres and wandered around virtual campuses in Second Life because the programming was actually quite intricate. To try and do anything really very immersive was actually very, very difficult. So it was much easier to just basically take the same visual metaphor and reproduce it. So that was something of a disappointment. I think there have been some fairly innovative technologies. I'm not against technology. I am an educational technologist at heart and an academic developer. But I think I would advocate something like Voicethread, which some of you will be aware of, I'm sure, which is basically a discussion forum that is in effect a virtual environment. You can contribute by audio, video, or text annotation. And you can see that's illustrated on the screen there. And you can embed that in various virtual learning environments. Certainly some of the experiments that I've done in teaching postgraduates, it's enabled them to respond in a much richer way, in a more immediate way than composing a well thought out written text piece. So I think it's very important to try and work out whether or not you are really just establishing the route and the mode, and even if it's something like a microcredit MOOC, all we are often doing is literally just laying a pathway through individuals and laying a groundwork for them as to where we think they should go. And I think real innovation comes when we focus away from us to them. So picking up on the two previous comments, I think certainly Jean-Claude talking about sort of the ability for students to make choices as they go, Fabio's comments about getting faculty to brainstorm and work together. There is a danger that we still think about innovation based on what we do for them rather than what we ask them to do. And I would argue that if we try and get to focus on getting students to agree their own destination, set their own outcomes with agreed awards, to determine a personal pathway, and how they're going to evidence those outcomes, and then choose how best to evidence those agreed outcomes. Fabio made a comment in his presentation to say, talking about assessment, saying hopefully a portfolio. And I think portfolios are almost certainly going to become the emerging form of the dominant form of assessment for any kind of independent, flexible learning mode, just because it then releases you in terms of the same sort of timetabling of exams and so on. So I think we shouldn't really be thinking about tweaking their mode of travel, giving them a new car to drive. We want to be thinking more about the way in which they are envisaging the journey and helping them to plan that journey ahead of themselves. We recognize learners are individuals. They live in a social and professional context. That's already been picked up on, certainly by what Jean-Claude said. And I think that's really very, very, very important, not least because we want to, as we increasingly teach internationally, we have to accept that students come with very, very different epistemological notions, a lot of different cultural contexts that lay themselves very differently to their engagement. That requires us, of course, to bit of control. If we focus on the technology, we then start worrying about how we're going to deliver that technology, how we mandate, how we make sure that it is the same individual. The question about whether you can check that the person sitting the exam is the person, that then becomes something of an obsession. And I think we then take some of the power away from the student. So my suggestion is that we really should be thinking about models in which we can negotiate outcomes with students. This is the distinction between formal and non-formal learning. We can talk about some of the UNESCO definitions later, perhaps, at the end. But I think arguably what we really want students to do is be defining some of their own intended learning outcomes. Now that requires us as institutions to be incredibly flexible in how we're going to validate and accredit and recognize those outcomes. And that's the real challenge. That's the body of work I think we should be doing as institutions, rather than trying to prepare a multitude of courses to fit every particular individual. If we let the individual decide how they want to learn, how they want to evidence, and our job is then to do whatever we can in order to assure that learning has happened. So negotiating the measurements of success is a very big part of it. What I'm very keen on, given the work that I've done in the UK around some of the access to education called the POISE project, which was very much about trying to get faculty to have a conversation with students at the very beginning of their studies, what their epistemological ideas are, what their frame of reference is. And I think one of the things we often neglect, which again reinforces what Jean-Claude said, is we often neglect to recognize that all our learners are situated and are surrounded by in-place resources. Bringing a student from a context to in our environment, no matter how rich it is still an abstract model of learning. And we need to be putting as much of the learning back into the student context. I don't think that's as hard as it might sound, given that we've got graduate profiles, we've got competency standards for most professional programs. We want to ensure that there is a broad provision, and so I suggest learning, and I can talk about those a bit later, but cognitive, metacognitive, the affective, psychomotor, and interpersonal domains, all of those domains of learning should be present in every study program that any student ever engages in. I think having a broader perspective on assessment, I would be very nervous about doing set exams in a flexible online open distance context. So trying to work out how you get patchwork, how you design patchwork and portfolio assessment to track the student, to make sure it is the same student that's producing each piece of work, basically by making it so heavily contextualized for that student. There's no way that they can get an essay farm to write an assignment for them, for example. And really to try and get them to contribute as much of their local situated in-place resources as possible. Now, all of those things do require us to have a shift in terms of some of the way that we provide our structured learning for students. And I think that is a major challenge. But I think rather than trying to tweak the map, we need to basically recognize that the real innovation, I believe, is in the learning design process itself. I was very intrigued by some of the comments that Fabio was making about the value of bringing people together to design things. I agree entirely. So I'm suggesting again that running design workshops is absolutely the way to design learning. There's no question. You should never leave an academic to go away and design learning on their own. It always has to be a collaborative effort. And you follow a particular model. The model I follow is an 8-stage learning design framework, but I think the crucial thing for me is to focus on making sure that you develop profiles of students and that everything is then based around fulfilling those learning objectives for those particular students. So takeaway from the session today, which I hope will at least stimulate some discussion later, perhaps at the end of the fourth presentation, is not to look to technology for the innovation solutions. I think building on what Jean-Claude and Fabio have already said, I think it's very important that we explore students' life contexts and that we design the learning to try and leverage that, to exploit that wherever we can. So I think that's me done, Mark.